We're back, and it's always a pleasure to say we're joined by one of our regulars here at Secure Freedom Radio. He is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. He is also a former counsel to the White Houses of George H.W. Bush, and before that, Ronald Reagan. He is a former naval intelligence officer. He is an author of two important books, one entitled Eagles and Evergreens, and the other called Narcotics and Terrorism. His name is Robert Charles. He's a good friend of mine and of this program, and a superb spokesman for, I believe, one of the most important organizations in the country, the Association of Mature American Citizens. Bobby Charles, it's good to have you back in the house virtually. Welcome.
Frank, it's always a privilege to be called. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, Bobby. You've written rather extensively on the acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse last week on all charges in connection with the allegation that he had murdered two individuals in connection with the rioting that they were engaged in Kenosha in the summer of 2020. You came up with 6 implications. I don't know if we can do justice to all of them, but give us a quick overview of what seems to have been a very salutary outcome of this trial and what is now in prospect concerning Kyle and his case.
Yeah, I think, to summarize the implications, there are the most immediate implications, which is that an innocent man who defended himself facing what seems like a perception of near death was acquitted and allowed to defend himself. And then there are the longer term implications. And I will just summarize them to say that this case essentially and very squarely, and the judge spoke about it afterwards, I think eloquently, this case defends the Second Amendment and its amplitude, its range, how we can use the Second Amendment to deter future violence and to defend ourselves and our families. It also vindicates or kind of, I think, should give us all a deep breath of gratitude that the Sixth Amendment continues to work, and that's the fair trial guarantee in our Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights is under fire. What does the case also do? It really gives the lie to the idea that you can preload an outcome. The Democrat leadership in Congress, as well as a lot of the media, in particular high tech, the sort of social media giants, tried to squeeze out any real discussion of this case on the merits ahead of time. They sort of preloaded it, including right up to and including the president, claiming that this was a defendant, 18-year-old, who was guilty. It turns out that a jury of his peers came down unanimously and said, no, he is within the rights that are provided to him by the Constitution of the United States. So my feeling is in the grand scheme, it's sort of a reawakening in people's mind's eye that these cases need not be politicized, or that attempts to politicize them from the outside will be repulsed by the basic obligation that we all have to sit on juries and to allow a free and fair trial to occur and an outcome to be based on the law, not based on politics. So the defense and I guess I'll call it the reaffirmation of the Second Amendment and its reach, and the reaffirmation of the Sixth Amendment and its reach in a time of high politics, to me, is very gratifying. It's very it's very salutary. It makes me feel like maybe the country actually knows what it's doing after all.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, high politics doesn't seem quite right to me. Hyperpolitics, maybe, and low politics certainly is much in evidence. But I think what you're getting at, Bobby, and you're an attorney, you've been in the federal judiciary system in various incarnations, but you've also been able to help lay people like us understand that this really speaks to something that it was becoming increasingly uncertain applied any longer, namely the rule of law, and specifically the equal justice under the law. Talk about those repercussions or implications of this ruling.
Yeah, so I mean, Frank, just to give people a 101, we have three branches of government, and we have a very political Congress now dominated by the Democrats, a very political White House. But we take great pride as a nation in believing that there's a balance between the branches, and that the third branch, the judiciary, will apply law in a way that allows our Constitution to be real, as it is not in many countries around the world. And one of the critical elements of that is the Sixth Amendment guarantee. Well, you get the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment guarantees of equal justice under law, essentially equal protection. But you also have this Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing, sadly, in the last, I don't know, I'll give it the last several years, is that outside influences, agitators, protesters, intimidators, social media have tried to infiltrate the jury room, and have tried, in a sense, to upset the apple cart and do away with the kind of people like Jimmy Stewart was in 12 Angry Men, the idea that a fair and free trial can actually exist. And what this trial does is, above and beyond the Second Amendment, it tells us jurors will not be intimidated. They understand. I mean, the media tried to follow the jury bus and was eventually castigated by the judge, who said, stop trying to intimidate the jurors. And the jurors were not intimidated. They came down unanimously in favor of the application of the law to these facts and said, this man is not guilty. And I think it's fascinating. I suspect downstream effects will be civil lawsuits filed against some of those that sort of prejudged this young man and put him sort of demonized him. We can't be in the business of demonizing one another. Or what happens is, not just the political world, but we begin to infect the integrity of our institutions. And this trial says, we're not going to let that happen. We average Americans, who sits on a jury trial? Who sits on a jury? Average Americans. That's who.
Hey, Bobby,
All of us
let me just ask
sit on
you
juries.
about one other possible upshot in terms of, you mentioned civil cases against those who slandered Kyle Rittenhouse. There's also an effort underway at the hands of the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler of New York, to have a do-over at the federal level. He's asking the Justice Department to review this case, saying that it created dangerous precedents. What's up with that, and what would the implications be if he succeeds?
Yeah, so if you speak about dangerous precedents, that's a dangerous precedent. I read about that, and Frank, at amac.us, people can go. I have a piece coming out later this week, which is a question mark at the end of the statement: "Return of the Star Chamber." In the 18th century, the Star Chamber in tyrannical Great Britain literally did what Jerry Nadler's talking about. They used the power of a centralized government to review and overturn verdicts, essentially with caprice, saying that that basically a jury of one's peers didn't get it right, and they would go so far as to intimidate jurors, the same way that this White House and Justice Department seem intent upon intimidating parents, rather shockingly, actually, into calling them domestic terrorists and applying a domestic terrorism law against parents who speak up in defense of their children at school boards, in order to prevent their children from being essentially federally brainwashed by things they don't think they should be brainwashed by. So,
Notably,
the school board,
critical race
CRT
theory and that sort of thing, yes.
That's right. The truth be told, school boards have always been local. It's a tradition in the United States. They're not federal, they're local. And so the notion that the FBI would somehow be deployed against a parent who uses sort of the Norman Rockwell approach and stands up bravely and says, look, I think my kids are more important than this federal, crap that's being thrown at them. The notion that you would then call them domestic terrorists is outrageous. And this is equally, what Nadler's done at the Justice Department is equally outrageous. You don't take a jury verdict reached anywhere in the United States fairly and without a mistrial, without any allegations of a mistrial, without any allegations of anything except, if anything, prosecutorial overreach. And you don't say, well, now we're going to take the Justice Department and try to flip that verdict. That is outrageous. Just the request, to my view, is what I would call extrajudicial. I mean, I was a clerk on the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Ninth Circuit isn't known for being particularly conservative. I don't think any justice would argue I don't think any judge would argue that the federal government should get into the business of relitigating a jury verdict that is unquestioned otherwise just because they don't like it politically.
Right. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that one of the happy, uplifting takeaways from the Rittenhouse verdict was that the rule of law seemed to apply after all, and one could expect equal justice under the law. Jerry Nadler's operation would unfortunately send that down the tubes, I'm afraid. Let me ask you about another matter that you have some expertise in as a result of your long and distinguished service in our government, namely your time on Capitol Hill with, I believe it was the Government Oversight Committee and some of its investigations. Bobby, talk a bit about this January 6th commission and what is going on with its prosecution of Steve Bannon, old friend of mine, and I think of yours as well.
Yeah, so I think what people need to do is step back and take a deep breath and understand that we have rules and we have institutions that apply those rules for a reason. We are, as John Adams once said, a country of laws, not of people. So the January 6th Commission is in many ways, I think it's the sixth of the investigative bodies that have been created to look at that criminal activity. But bottom line is that commission is arch partisan. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand it's partisan. And in that sense, it's probably not dramatically different from a lot of other committees. But what they are doing is they're misusing the subpoena power. And that's the part that I find really shocking. In the piece about the Star Chamber, I also go to the point that what they've done is they've taken a private individual who was in conversation with a president. So the president has the right, you can go to CRS or anywhere else and look, a president has the right to assert executive privilege that generally survives, the courts would say, his office. So if you are the president and I give you advice, and then later Congress says, hey, I want to know what advice you gave that president, the president, the former president, has the right to say, look, and it's justiciable. It's been decided. You can't just go in and then say, I need to unearth everything that president heard from advisors. Now, here's the really peculiar part. Only back in Watergate, that we're going back almost 60 years, 70 years, to find an example of the process by which a Congress would subpoena someone who has talked with the president and asked for that information to be made public, either in written or testimonial form. The right and proper. So what happens is Congress, and this Congress did this. They issue a subpoena. In this case, the individual says, no, I'm not going to comply with that subpoena because that violates, and a president probably could say the same thing, and the courts would come down in their favor, I would think, saying that you can't comply, that you can't force that individual to talk about things they said with the president, nor the president to say what he got from that individual, unless there's a very concrete criminal act being alleged, which there is not here. So what they do is they then vote contempt. And we subpoenaed, for example, Janet Reno when she was Attorney General, and she refused to comply, and we voted contempt. Okay. Typically, that's happened dozens and dozens of times, Democrats and Republicans, and it's basically a statement. It's putting a stake in the sand, and you say, "Gosh, you're kind of offending us because you're not coming and complying with our partisan subpoena," and that's usually the end of it. There might be an accommodation. Not in this case. With Bannon, they actually turned around, got a grand jury indictment, indicted him on 2 counts, misdemeanors, and they're threatening to punish him criminally. Well, we haven't done that since we actually brought G. Gordon Liddy in for a very specific criminal act related to Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon ended up resigning for a cover-up. Bottom line is, this is a disproportionate act, a political act, and the reason that I relate it to the Star Chamber is we do not in this country, as a general matter, counsel the idea that we will abuse our legal system in order to punish someone politically. And I think Bannon has a fairly strong case that this is a disproportionate overreach by this Congress to try to compel him to basically be as a political pawn here to try to get back at Trump. And I just find it very disheartening because this is not what this country's about.
Well, worse yet, it seems to me pretty transparently the case that the chairman and the so-called Republican ranking member of this commission are desperate to shut Steve Bannon's War Room Pandemic program down. And I think that's the real motive here, more than trying to extract from him some sort of information about Trump. It's political warfare
Frank,
against one of the most effective political warriors on the opposition side.
Well, Frank, that's even more offensive because you don't use the system, you don't use a subpoena, and then our judicial system, and particularly the heavy hand of criminal allegations against someone in order to silence or to coerce a political outcome. I mean, that's pseudo-Soviet. We don't do that in this country.
Well, we didn't used to do that in this country, but we sure seem to be doing it now, and you're right to call it out. Let me ask you about one other possibility here, which may be, knowing Steve Bannon, how he would like to jujitsu this act of political warfare and suppression against him into something for good, which would be essentially to prosecute the case against Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and those responsible for the security of the Capitol grounds on the 6th of January for essentially dereliction of duty or malfeasance, or perhaps even worse, according to some, maybe collusion in a bit of direct action, a false flag operation. This doesn't seem likely to be the subject of any kind of scrutiny by the January 6th Commission. But Bobby Charles, knowing the court system as you do, would a defendant be able to put on a defense that requires testimony of some of those I've mentioned and others to make the case that actually there was very considerable wrongdoing perpetrated by not him, not Donald Trump, but the people running the Congress, perhaps on both sides of the aisle?
Frank, my answer may surprise you. I don't think the use of the courts for political purposes is healthy generally. And that is to say, I go to the first cause, and the first cause is the misuse of the subpoena power and by the Justice Department in criminalizing something that has no basis in being made a criminal act and putting Steve Bannon or anyone else, any other private citizen, through the act of defending themselves, which is costly and emotionally costly, et cetera. Even if he's game for the emotional cost, my own gut is that kind of a political dialogue, although he could try it in that venue, is not likely, I'm just guessing, but not likely to be permitted by a judge. And the reason is that you have rules of evidence, and they limit what you can bring into a courtroom. It doesn't mean you can't try, and it doesn't mean that you can't speak about it outside the courtroom. But, my own gut, Frank, is just that if at first we decide we're going to abuse the legal process and we're going to turn it into politics, we're all going to wish we hadn't done that. And what's sad about this is I don't see him initiating a lawsuit. I see Democrat leaders in the House and this Justice Department and this White House consenting, perhaps even promoting the idea that they will politicize things that are traditionally not political, and that is upsetting. That's not what we expect of our judiciary.
Just last point. My only thought is that if the question really before the court or before the commission, for that matter, was this an insurrection brought about by people at the behest of or inspired by or otherwise encouraged to seize the Capitol by Donald Trump and his, advisors, past or present at the time? The question that Steve Bannon, it would seem to me, could legitimately ask is, well, what about the evidence that the doors of the Capitol were open to people?
Yeah.
There wasn't an onslaught. We're hard out of time, Bobby, and I would give you 30 seconds to say something very quickly, and I take your point that the court may not allow any of this, but it's an intellectual exercise at the moment that I think perhaps Nancy Pelosi and her friends ought to be mindful of having set in motion with this prosecution of Steve Bannon. Go ahead quickly.
So 30 seconds. Nutshell version is if you light a fire, be careful it doesn't become a forest fire and consume you. Mr. Bannon would be fully within his rights within the context of that commission's testimony outside of a courtroom to say whatever he wanted. And I think you're absolutely right. Misjudging this or miscataloguing this as an armed type thing. I've seen these all over the country, all over the world, rather. That is not what this is. This is something different. And I think that he would have a right if he was testifying to say whatever he thought about that.
Yeah. Well, and maybe get some other testimony as well. You're the lawyer. I just play one on TV sometimes, but I'm always delighted to talk with you. Bobby Charles, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your extraordinary service to our country that involves so many different roles in various branches of our government, including the military. And also thanks for what you are doing these days as a spokesman for AMEC.us. Keep up the good work, my friend. Come back to us again soon. Tracy Bradford joins us next. We'll talk about Texas with a lieutenant gubernatorial candidate. That and more straight ahead.